Welcome back to Reasoning Through the Bible. We're working our way through the book of Matthew. Today we're starting in Matthew chapter 12. A little bit of review before we jump in. Matthew, of course, presents Jesus as king. He presents all the things that would be required of a king, such as the fulfillment of prophecies at the beginning, talks a lot about fulfillment. He presents Jesus as the son of David in the very first verse, the heir of the literal kingdom that will reign forever. He gives the kingly genealogy in chapter 1. Jesus has a herald, John the Baptist, that goes out before the king and announcing the king is coming. Jesus is then tempted by the devil, but does not sin. Jesus and John the Baptist's first message is repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so then Jesus' first teaching was in Matthew's chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And right after that, he does a series of miracles to prove he is both God and the promised Messiah. And as we sit here in Matthew chapter 12, the Jewish leaders have started to reject Jesus, and he will soon change his tone. We're in the middle of that now with Matthew chapter 12.
Yeah, and along with starting to reject him, they've also started to challenge him directly and challenge his authority, because he has been teaching with authority. He's been amazing the people with the things that he's been doing and the miracles. And so now they're directly opposing him, trying to expose him in their mind.
And so that's where we pick up the story here in Matthew chapter 12, and I'll dive in at verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of the grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." So here in this passage, the Pharisees are angry at Jesus because of breaking the Sabbath rules.
Right.
So that's the important part here, is that it was on the Sabbath. So Steve, what did the Mosaic Law say about the Sabbath day?
You were supposed to rest on the Sabbath. And there were some other things that were given in the Mosaic Law with some specificities regarding that. But again, as we talked about earlier in another session, there was also this oral tradition and oral law that the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought that the Messiah was also going to acknowledge. And Jesus wasn't acknowledging that, and he had been challenging that through his Sermon on the Mount and other things as well. So this is that same sort of a situation where they're, literally, hey, you're not supposed to do any work or do anything on the Sabbath. He kind of set them straight.
So in the Pharisees' defense, how important was Sabbath keeping in the Mosaic Law relative to other things? How important was it?
Well, it was something that they were supposed to do as a rest period and as a dedication to the Lord. But at the same time, we see in other parts of the scripture that says that the Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath wasn't made for God, right?
Right. And so the Sabbath keeping was indeed important.
Yeah.
It was one of the 10 Commandments. God felt it important enough to where he made it one of the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And do you remember what the punishment was for breaking the Sabbath?
No, I don't.
This is one of the reasons why it was in the 10 Commandments. And breaking the Sabbath was a capital offense. If somebody was to break the Sabbath and intentionally work on the Sabbath, they were to be stoned to death. That's how important God put it.
Yeah.
It was up there. God said, "You will rest."
Right. But I think the key word that you used there was intentional, right? Intentionally worked.
Intentionally worked. So in verse 1, what were the disciples doing as they walked through the grain fields?
They were grabbing the grain, right? And as we talked about in our discussion of Ruth, there was always parts of the corners of the fields that were left for travelers that were going by. And so this was things that God had made a provision for travelers that were going through. So they're going through the field and they're just grabbing the wheat, the heads of the wheat, and they're eating them as they go.
It's basically a snack.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a little bit that I might snack on as I'm walking along.
Right.
And since it was the Sabbath day, they were probably either going to or coming from synagogue. Mm-hmm. And so as part of that, they walked along, grabbed a little snack, and kept going.
Yeah.
The Mosaic Law had some rules about what the farmers were to do on their grain fields. Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, they were to not harvest the corners of the fields or go back and pick anything they missed.
Right.
And the specific reason was so that people walking along might have something to snack on as they traveled.
Right.
And there was another rule in the Mosaic Law, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, specifically permitted someone to pluck anyone else's grain, was legal to pluck as long as it was only the amount you could hold in your hand. Mm-hmm. So they specifically set up in the Mosaic Law, God specifically set up a way for travelers to have something to snack on as they were walking along.
Yeah.
And so this is what they were doing. So in that sense, they were indeed following the law. But again, one of the reasons why the Pharisees were so particular about this was because when we covered this when we were back in the book of Judges, Israel had disobeyed the law tremendously, and God punished them for it.
Yeah.
And so the pain of the Babylonian captivity, once they came back from that, the Jewish leaders said, we're not going to let that happen again. And so they got to be very serious about keeping the rules.
Right.
Well, here they were so serious that they got overboard with it.
Yeah.
Was this really work?
No.
I mean, were they really working?
No, they weren't.
They're just walking along and grab a little bit and rub it in your hands and blow off the chaff and keep going. And so that's why they were doing this. And they weren't really working. I mean, to call this work is really a stretch.
Yeah.
And so then Jesus gives, starting in verse 3, 4, and 5, he gives two stories as a response. Mm-hmm. One of which is David eating the showbread when he was hungry.
Right.
And the other one was the priests. The word that Jesus used here is profaning the Sabbath every week when they do their duties. So let's kind of go through this, Steve. Mm-hmm. First of all, what is showbread?
So showbread was part of the temple in the holy place. So the way the temple was set up, and the tabernacle as well. And by the way, the temple was where the sacrifices were made and where God dwelt in the tabernacle through the wilderness years and etc. And so it was their main place of worship. It wasn't something that was set up along different areas of the land. Those were the synagogues that they went to. The temple was the place of worship. And it was set up, you had an outer court, and then you had inside the building, you had the first place that was called the holy place. And then behind that, a curtain of Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was and where the high priest went. But in the holy place, you had several artifacts that were in there. One was a deal of incense.
Altar of incense
that was lit. You had the lampstick that was in there as well, lampstand. And then you also had a table of showbread. And these were elements and articles that the priests would take care of every day. They would keep the lamp lit, they would keep the incense going, and they would also make the bread that would be on this table of showbread.
And twice a day, they were to do what? Sacrifice an animal outside.
Right.
One in the morning, one in the evening.
Right.
And they were to do this every day, even on the Sabbath.
Right.
So one of the things Jesus is saying here is that on the Sabbath, the priests have to work.
Right.
The showbread got changed every week. Every Sabbath day, part of the Mosaic Law was that the priest had to bake 12 loaves of bread and go into the holy place and change out these 12 loaves of bread. And they had to lay them out exactly the right way. And then they were to eat the showbread. The only ones that could eat this bread were the priests.
Right.
Well, he tells the story of David in verse 3. Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, and entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, the showbread?
Yeah.
So do you remember that story? What was the story? If you liked what you heard, subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible today. Don't miss this opportunity to grow in your knowledge and love of God's Word. Subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible on your favorite podcast platform.
Well, I think it was the period of time whenever Saul was after David, right? And he had been chasing him, and David had been running from him and hiding from him, and they were having this conflict going back and forth. And it came a period of time when David had been running, and he was hungry and was depleted because he had been running from him, and he goes into the Holy of Holy and he grabs some of the bread.
David was innocent, and he was being chased by King Saul,
Right.
who was an evil king.
Yep.
And David was running and didn't have any food. And he goes to the priest and says, hey, you got any food for us? This is in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And so the priest said, the only bread we have is the consecrated showbread, but you can have that.
Yeah.
And David and his companions took that bread and ate it. So
Right.
what was his point here when he says, have you not read what David did?
Well, I think the point is that it was offered to him from the priest, right? It wasn't something that he went in and took. It was something that was offered to him, and the priests allowed him to take it. So it shows that under certain conditions, I'm not quite sure I want to use that wording, but there's times whenever things that can be done on the Sabbath out of necessity, that the Sabbath can be broken, so to speak, in order to bring about whatever it might be that you're doing.
Right. And that's the whole point here,
Yeah.
is that there's kind of a hierarchy of moral good and evil. And yes, resting on the Sabbath is good, but we shouldn't, in this example, somebody comes along that's hungry,
Right.
say, oh, no, you can't have this bread. It's
Right.
the Sabbath day and you're not supposed to eat it, so you just have to go hungry. Well, no, somebody that's legitimately hungry, it's more important to feed them than it is to keep this religious ritual.
Right.
And that's what Jesus was saying, was that there's this hierarchy of moral good. Same thing with his story. Have you read that the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? And we talked about that. But the priest had to work. It was
Right.
just another work day. They worked 7 days a week. They did it in shifts. But
Right.
they had to bake the bread. They had to go lay it out. They had to keep the oil lamp going. They had to keep the altar of incense going. They had to sacrifice the animals. They did all that on the Sabbath day. And he's saying it's okay for the priests to do this because the temple and the temple work was more important than the idea of resting on this 1 day a week. God had commanded them to do this.
Right.
The temple was the symbol of worshiping God, and that was much more important than this religious rule about Sabbath keeping. So he said the temple was greater than the Sabbath rule.
It's also showing, once again, that Jesus fully comprehends and understands the laws that were given. And
Yes.
obviously it would be, because he is God. And so he's demonstrating to them that they truly don't completely understand the laws and what they were given for and what they were provided for. So once again, he's expanding on it and showing them the true meaning of what this particular law is talking about.
The Pharisees were so focused on keeping the letter of the law that they used it in a bad way, even an
Right.
evil way. They
Right.
turned the Sabbath and all these other Mosaic laws into a burden that they wanted to lay on people, and it made life more difficult. And this is where, Steve, you were alluding a while ago to say the Sabbath was made for us.
Right.
It was a benefit for us, not an obligation
Right.
for us. That was the whole point that they missed.
And another thing to bring up here is in regards to that. There's kind of in our human nature, it's in us to obey rules and obey laws. That's what we really want to do. If we break them, we have a guilt, so to speak, about it. Now, we might rationalize whatever it might be in regards to it, but we still have it that, hey, we're breaking a rule. And so here the Pharisees and the ruling class, they had gotten to that where they would, what you mentioned, they would just bash it over the people's head. You're breaking a rule. You're breaking a rule. You're breaking a rule. You're doing this. And it was beating the people down rather than being there to uplift the people and to glorify God. And
they're laying burdens on them.
Correct. Right. And by the way, this comes right after Jesus at the end of chapter 11 says, take on my yoke, right? Yeah. Because my yoke is easy, right? And my burden is light.
Right. So in verse 5, have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priest in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? So it's what we just talked about, right? Yeah. They do all this work, and the reason they're innocent is because the Sabbath work in honor of God was more important than the Sabbath rule to rest. The next verse, verse 6, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. So his point is, if it's okay for the priest to work on the Sabbath because the temple work is so important,
right?
What's this other thing here that he's talking about that's greater than the temple? It's him.
You're right. Yep.
He says something greater than the temple here. What's he talking about? He said
himself. Yeah.
Himself. He is greater than the temple. So being with Jesus is greater than keeping a religious rule about rest on the Sabbath. That's what he's saying.
Right.
And so then in verse 7, what does he mean here when he says, I desire compassion or mercy and not sacrifice?
It means that the sacrifice was a ritual, but it's the idea behind the sacrifice. And if people were doing a sacrifice just because it was a ritual part and they weren't truly sacrificing in worship to God, then it didn't mean anything, right? And so you have compassion is something that is greater than just doing something out of writ or because there's a rule that says you must do it. It's showing that there's a difference between the two, right?
Right. And he's actually quoting Hosea 6:6. There's a verse in the Old Testament prophets, Hosea, that says this exact words. And so what he's saying here is if you think of what is a sacrifice, a sacrifice is giving up something.
Correct.
I'm giving up something for God.
Right.
And so sacrifice in that day was giving up an animal that I sacrificed or giving up money, giving up time. And it's the same thing in our day. We don't sacrifice the animals, but we give up something.
Right.
And in this case, what he's saying here is that giving up something, not doing something, keeping some rule is less important than compassion and mercy and love and things like that. Being loving towards others, being merciful and compassionate towards people is what God really wants.
Right.
And not a list of rules about what you're going to give up.
Right.
Giving up more things, giving more money, giving more time, sacrificing more is, there's nothing wrong with sacrifice, but God says what I really want is compassion and mercy and love. That's what he's really interested in, not doing religious things.
And, in our day, we might not have specific rules or as many rules as what they were holding the people to, some of us and some of the people that are listening, because we tend to think of those main 10 commandments, right? But we do have other things that we do. Some of it might be, every time the church doors are open, I need to be up there at the church. And if you're not at the church when the church doors are open, whether it's weekday or Sunday morning or Sunday evening, then God is disappointed in me. Therefore, I've got to be there and I've got to do that. But that's the same type of mentality as far as rule keeping. The purpose of going should be that you're going there to worship God. You are giving up a sacrifice. Maybe you're not going fishing. Maybe you're not doing some type of recreational sport. Maybe there's things. So that in itself is a sacrifice, but the purpose is to go and worship God. And if you're going out of guilt and not worshiping God, you could be put in the same situation, right?
Right. What I always think of is Lent.
Yeah.
Many Christian traditions sacrifice something. People give up something for Lent. They'll not eat something, or they'll give up something for the Lenten period. And nothing wrong with that. There's a benefit to that at times.
Right.
But the idea I think Jesus is saying here is, if we were to say, okay, well, I'm going to really practice Lent, and I'm going to give up 2 things.
Right.
Or I'm going to give up 5 things. Or I'm going to give up 20 things. I'm going to increase the amount of things I give up for Lent. Well, Jesus is saying that's not really what he's interested in.
The number and quantity isn't the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What he's saying is, what I really want is mercy,
Right.
and compassion, and
Right.
love. So that's what he means when he says, I desire compassion and not sacrifice. How much you give up for Lent is not as important as, are you a loving and compassionate person?
Right.
And then he kind of culminates all this in verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
What does he mean there?
Well, I think it's another area where he's claiming that he is God himself, right?
Yes.
And that God created the Sabbath. And so he's definitely saying, Son of Man, me, I'm the Lord over the Sabbath. I am God, right?
And as God, and he created the Sabbath, gave
Right.
the commandment to give the Sabbath,
Right.
then what does that mean about his ability to decide what's legal
Exactly.
and not legal on the Sabbath?
He knows truly what it means and why it was given and et cetera. Yeah.
So if we were to summarize this little section here, it's really, really great. Verse 6, Jesus is greater than the temple. Verse 8, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And down at the end of the chapter, he talks in verse 41 and verse 42, we hadn't read that yet, but he talks about him being greater than Jonah and him being greater than Solomon.
Yeah.
So if we look at those clues throughout this chapter, what does that say about Jesus? It lifts him up to a very high level,
Right.
Greater than Jonah, greater than Solomon, greater than any of the Old Testament prophets, greater than the temple, the ability to decide what is legal and not legal on the Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath. So that lifts Jesus to the very highest level. And Steve, if you could then read the next section, start at verse 9 and go through 14. There's another issue here about the Sabbath day.
Departing from there, he went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they might accuse him. And he said to them, What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him.
Okay, so again, this is the Sabbath day, which is kind of the critical issue here.
Right.
And the Pharisees must have been watching him. They're watching him and his disciples walk through the grain fields, and now they're watching him inside the synagogue.
Yeah, and challenging him again. Right?
And they asked this question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, when they asked that question, were they really curious? They were just genuinely didn't know the answer?
No, because it says there in verse 10, so that they might accuse him. I mean, that was their purpose and their motivation, is that they're trying to, in their mind, expose him as a charlatan or somebody that he's really not who he says he is.
Right. They're trying to put him in a paradox.
Yeah.
If either way he answers, he's kind of in a bad spot. If he says it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath, they'd accuse him of violating the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath.
Right.
If he said it's not lawful to heal on the Sabbath, they would accuse him of being inconsistent, since he had just said it was okay to pluck grain on the Sabbath.
Right.
So it's really a trap. They're just asking him questions, trying to trip him up and have something to accuse him with. What happens throughout the gospel every time somebody tries to trap Jesus?
I was just fixing to say, they post questions to him expecting or a yes or no answer. He never gives a yes or no answer. He gives an explanation. And that's one thing that drives him up the wall, so to speak, in that they can't trap him. And the explanations, just like the one he gives here, are practical explanations, whether it might be an expansion of what the question was or something. But again, They try and trap him with yes or no answers, and he doesn't provide yes or no, or yes or no questions, and he doesn't provide yes or no answers to them.
It's almost humorous to watch.
Yeah.
But every single time they try to put him into a dilemma where they would think, okay, we got him now. And he always thinks of a way that they weren't thinking of, or he undermines their whole situation, things like that. And so this is no different. What does he say and how does he respond? He asks of what in verse 11?
Well, he says, how many of you that has a sheep and it's trapped fell in a hole or something, that they're not going to go out and take that out? They're not going to let the sheep just lay there all day long and potentially lose it. And again, this is an agrarian society. They depend on the sheep for food and for clothing and other things as well. So it's a practical point, and it's something that they do. I mean, it's obvious if they haven't done it before, he wouldn't bring it up. So it's something that they know, that there are exceptions to this Sabbath keeping, that is very practical exceptions. And
really, his answer is at the end of verse 12. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That's what he's really telling them, is that it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath.
Right.
And he's saying that works of mercy and necessity override the rule to not work on the Sabbath.
Correct.
In verse 14, the Jews didn't think it was okay to heal on the Sabbath, but what were they doing on the Sabbath? Plotting to kill him.
Yeah.
So somehow it's not okay to go get a snack off the heads of grain.
Right.
And somehow it's a problem trying to heal somebody, but it's okay to go plot and murder an innocent man.
Yeah, and what this does, this exposes their heart, which Jesus obviously knew. So he knew their intentions and he knew their heart. And this verse that's here just exposes it for us and gives what their true motivation is and everything else. And you think about that now. He's been doing miracles. He's been expanding on what the word and the law has through his preaching and his teaching. He's been doing it with authority. He's got thousands of people that are following him in different areas, and he's doing all of these different things. And yet their response is, we need to trap him and expose him. And now it's escalated to the point that we need to kill him. We need to get rid of him. They're going in the opposite direction in regards to what they should be doing.
Right. Now, you had mentioned rightfully, look at what Jesus had been doing in previous chapters. There was a whole chapter and a half, 2 chapters of him healing people. He healed blind man, cleansed a leper, raised a girl from the dead. He had been doing healings all over the place. There were verses in there where he said he healed everybody. So there were probably thousands of people that had been healed. And nowhere do the Pharisees ever question whether these healings were real, because there were too many of them around to question. They knew what he would do when he runs into this man with this withered hand. And so they purposely find a situation where there's a man there that needs healing. They have a pretty good idea he's going to heal this person.
Right.
They ask him the question, is it lawful to heal? And so what they're wanting is to see him do a work, something that would qualify as a work, so that they could accuse him. And again, the punishment for breaking the Sabbath was capital punishment. They're looking for an excuse to say, I saw him work on the Sabbath, so we can now kill him.
Right.
And so the interesting part that I kind of get a smile out of, Jesus doesn't really do anything physical. He asks them, is it okay to do good? And what does he say in verse 13? Jesus doesn't physically do anything.
He just asked the man to stretch out his hand.
And even in the Mosaic arguments about work, and at no point did they ever even say stretching out your hand was a work. Jesus didn't even do that. He just told the man, let me see your hand, stretch out your hand.
And it's healed.
He didn't spit and make mud. He didn't touch him. He didn't say any incantations. He
didn't say your hand is healed. He just said, stretch it out. And he stretched it out and it was healed.
So Jesus healed the man.
Yeah.
But he didn't do anything physical that they could call work.
Right.
And so that's the funny part. I mean, I think there's humor in the Bible. And to me, these Pharisees are so mad that they're so blind that they're trying to accuse an innocent man here. And Jesus just says, He didn't say anything. He just said, stretch out your hand.
Yeah. And once again, they just saw the man had a withered hand and he holds it out. And when he holds it out, it's no longer withered. And their reaction is, well, we got to get rid of this guy.
We got to kill Jesus.
We got to get rid of this guy. It's just bizarre.
Nothing in there about this man that couldn't work. This was an agricultural society.
Yeah.
A man with no hand.
Right.
He's going to be poor. And now he's healed and he can make a living for himself and his family and ought to feel good about that. Nothing in here about the Pharisees saying, oh, praise God, this man was healed. No. Let's go kill Jesus.
And what this does is it shows that why they were mad. He was challenging their authority because they were trying to trap him. They were telling the people, you can't do work on the Sabbath. You can't do this on the Sabbath. You can't do that on the Sabbath because that qualifies as work, using this one example of the Sabbath. And Jesus is directly challenging that. So he's challenging their authority. That's really the reason why they're wanting to get rid of him, is this guy is coming in here and upsetting the apple cart that we have and showing us up in front of all the people that we're supposed to have authority over.
That's why they were angry.
That's the crux of it. Yeah.
So spiritual application. In a spiritual sense, our hands are withered also. All of our hands are withered from a human perspective. We can do no good work. Just like this man in an agricultural society couldn't work with a withered hand. And so the spiritual sense here is that all humans have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have no ability to do a good work to please God. We're totally incapable of doing a good work that could please God. All we can do is go to Christ and pray that he heals us. The good news is Christ is so loving that he can heal us. And then after we're healed, after we're saved, we are able to do good work for his kingdom.
Right.
The other thing I notice here is that in verse 12, he says, how much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? Notice that Jesus tells us that people have much more worth and value than animals. Animals are valuable. We should take care of them. We have a responsibility to do right by animals, but humans are much more valuable than animals. The Bible repeatedly makes a very clear statement that people are valuable, people have worth in of ourselves, and we are much more valuable than animals. The other thing is these passages here show a turn in the book of Matthew, a clear turn to where now the attitude of the Pharisees are strongly against Jesus. They're trying to trap him. They're going around, following around, watching him, trying to get instances where he's guilty of something so they can accuse him. They're plotting to kill him. They're actively trying to kill him. They've not just not accepted him. They've totally rejected him as Messiah and are plotting to get rid of him. They've completely rejected him and his message. And so Jesus is now, in coming chapters, is going to modify the way he teaches, turning into parables and ways to teach important concepts.
And you can't interpret that any other way. When you're plotting to kill somebody, you've rejected them.
Correct. Verse 14, the Pharisees went out and conspired against him so they might destroy him. But Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. So he was aware of what they were doing, even though he was not near them. They had left the synagogue and gone out. He was aware of what they were doing, what they were thinking, even though they were not right there in front of him. That was another thing that only God can do.
Right.
So probably a good spot to draw to a close for now. And we're in wonderful messages here about Jesus. And we're going to see next time what happens when the great crowds follow him and he heals all of them. And what happens next time. Hope you'll join us on Reasoning Through the Bible.